We are just 2 weeks into this Trump administration, and already we are making huge changes that has the left and Democrats on their heels and panicking. Right now, Elon Musk and Doge, they are digging through the deep state apparatus, USAID, and finding so much corruption and theft. And seeing it be uncovered is something that I never honestly thought I would see in my lifetime. So, for us conservatives who were thinking that we would never see real change, we're starting to see some of it. And again, we are just getting started 2 weeks into this administration. So, this next 4 years looks promising. Now, Trump is also trying to get his cabinet picks through. Tulsi Gabbard, Kash Patel, and Bobby Kennedy are up this week. So far, things look okay as far as getting them all confirmed. There is a lot of pressure from MAGA on these Republican senators who are waffling. So they're feeling the heat, and I think we're going to get them through. Now, one pick that did get through, 99-0, was Marco Rubio for Secretary of State. And he is the one person that I think is the most interesting because as Secretary of State, he's obviously executing our foreign policy. But he's also a person that in the past has a neocon sort of background. He's been more closer to McCain in, say, 2016 than Donald Trump. So when he was picked, a lot of people on the right, not everybody, especially libertarians, were concerned that he was a bad pick and was going to sort of thwart the America First agenda of Donald Trump. But so far, listening to him, seeing what he's doing, I do have some confidence that he's going to move in the right direction and that he is drifting more toward our point of view rather than the viewpoints of, say, John McCain and the neocons. And he recently did an interview with Megyn Kelly, and he talked about his foreign policy vision. This was a 1 hour interview, a good interview, but I want to go through and just pick out a few parts where he says things that are, I find interesting and that really points to the direction that he's heading toward. Some of it's good, some of it's really, really good, and some of it does sort of regress back to that establishment Republican neocon foreign policy. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag, but in totality, I think he's moving in the right direction. So I want to go through these clips and break it down. Again, a good interview, Megyn Kelly, and these are the more interesting parts. First, talking about the global order.
I think it's also a lot of pragmatic. Every conversation I've had with foreign leaders, to the extent it's been conflictive or that we've had areas of conflict to talk about, I've been very clear, and that is, look, I expect you to do what you're doing because you're acting in your national interest. And I know you've gotten used to a foreign policy in which you act in the national interest of your country, and we sort of act in the interest of the globe, or the global order. But we're led by a different kind of person now, and under President Trump, we're going to do what you do. And one of the terms that President Trump's loves is reciprocity. And it's very simple, but I think people would understand it. If you charge us a 50% tariff for an American product to enter your country, we should charge you a 50% tariff here. Maybe 55, President Trump likes to have leverage too. And who would not argue that that's not fair? And how can you argue against it? But that's been our policy in many cases. In country after country around the world, we have no access to their markets, but their products have open and free access to ours. How can that continue? That's absurd. I think anybody who has common sense would argue that. Frankly, I think a lot of these leaders have been wondering why it took us so long to figure that out. But under President Trump, they know we have.
Let's start with the tariff issue because that is in the news right now with Canada and Mexico. Trump obviously uses the threat of tariffs as a weapon to get what he wants as far as, negotiating new deals. And already Mexico and Canada have changed their position. They're going to do more at the border, and they are going to enter into negotiations with the Trump administration to further that even more. And also with tariffs, obviously, our club of growth people hate tariffs because the U.S. corporations have gotten massively wealthy by having free trade and no tariffs. But if we look over the last 40 years, we can see that tariffs, as far as the middle class, has not helped. So while it might help expand our GDP, it doesn't really say much about wealth distribution. Not to sound like a Marxist here, but just because your GDP grows doesn't mean that it's expanding your middle class. Again, the tariffs or lack thereof have helped big corporations just get richer and richer and richer. Also, tariffs are used by every country. This attitude that tariffs are so destructive just isn't true 100%. Oftentimes, developing countries will use tariffs to protect new industries. For example, India, they have a lot of tariffs on U.S. goods because they're trying to increase their industrial capacity, but their industries can't compete with first world countries like the United States, who are way ahead on that curve as far as perfecting techniques to produce a lot for cheap. So if you want to grow your industrial base, you have to protect your native industries from other countries. So India, again, has tons of tariffs on U.S. goods and import quotas. And they're not the only country. A lot of countries do this. But for some reason, when the United States and Trump mentions tariffs, everybody freaks out. And they are absolutely overreacting. And again, when we look at China and our supply lines during COVID, they were able to exert pressure on us by threatening to cut off those supply lines. So not having an industrial base and not manufacturing certain products is a national security issue. So tariffs should be used in certain places to protect your industries that need to grow, and also to protect your national security. The other thing that Rubio mentioned was the liberal order and the United States working in our own interest rather than working in the interest of the global order. And under President Obama, that's the way it felt. And even Obama made statements where he said he was sort of working not just for the United States, but for the globe generally. So Rubio is saying, we're done with that. What is in the interest of America? That's where it begins, and that is where it ends. And that's the way foreign policy should always be. So that is good from Marco Rubio. The next clip, the multipolar world. This is interesting.
The interest of American foreign policy is to further the national interest of the United States of America, right? I mean,
America first.
Well, and that's the way the world has always worked. The way the world has always worked is that the Chinese will do what's in the best interest of China, the Russians will do what's in the best interest of Russia, the Chileans are going to do what's in the best interest of Chile, and the United States needs to do what's in the best interest of the United States. Where our interests align, that's where you have partnerships and alliances. Where our differences are not aligned, that is where the job of diplomacy is to prevent conflict while still furthering our national interest and understanding they're going to further theirs. And that's been lost. And I think that was lost at the end of the Cold War because we were the only power in the world. And so we assumed this responsibility of sort of becoming the global government in many cases, trying to solve every problem. And there are terrible things happening in the world. There are. And then there are things that are terrible that impact our national interest directly. And we need to prioritize those again. So it's not normal for the world to simply have a unipolar power. That was an anomaly. It was the product of the end of the Cold War. But eventually you were going to reach back to a point where you had a multipolar world, great powers in different parts of the planet. We face that now with China and to some extent, Russia. And then you have rogue states like Iran and North Korea you have to deal with. So now more than ever, we need to remember that foreign policy should always be about furthering the national interest of the United States and doing so to the extent possible, avoiding war and armed conflict.
Now, isn't that interesting? Rubio is saying that a unipolar world is an anomaly and that we usually exist in a multipolar world, and that is what we are heading back towards. That's really, really interesting coming from a Secretary of State of the United States. And as he points out, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 90s, we had that unipolar moment. And we tried to capitalize on that by expanding NATO toward Russia to try to contain and eventually destabilize Russia and cause it to collapse and break it apart into little pieces so we could incorporate it into our liberal world order. Well, we tried that, and this Ukraine war is part of that, and it is a failure. It did not work. And at the same time, China, since the 90s, has been rising, and now they are a huge power that is competing directly with the United States. So he recognizes the unipolar moment is over. It was an anomaly. We live in a multipolar world, the US, China, and Russia. And we have to accept that reality and learn how to get along without blowing this whole planet up. So hearing Rubio acknowledge that we are no longer just the only power and that we have to cooperate, I think is a huge step, for a U.S. Secretary of State. So again, another good thing from Rubio. Now to Ukraine.
Ukraine's another issue that's got the party divided. You've got a lot. I'm sticking within Republicans now because there's a whole other debate with the other side of the aisle, but who say, no, Putin's a bad actor, Russia's a growing threat, and we're doing the right thing by backing Ukraine. And I would say the majority of Republicans now are against that viewpoint and think we've spent too much. It's any place from 105 billion to 187 billion. And they've lost. We just have to be realistic about the fact that Ukraine has lost. It's not going to gain back any of this ground, and we need a negotiated settlement now before we keep throwing good money after bad, and we can't afford it. We've got Americans who are suffering now. I think that's the majority view, even on the Republican side now.
Let me stop right there. Zelensky just came out and said that they have not received tens of billions of dollars that we say that we gave them. So she's talking about all the money we've given Ukraine. Apparently, a lot of money is missing, and God knows where it went.
So happens to be the reality on the ground. First, let me say this. We think what Putin did was terrible. Invading a country, the atrocities he's committed, he did horrible things. But what the dishonesty that has existed is that we somehow led people to believe that Ukraine would be able not just to defeat Russia, but destroy them, push them all the way back to what the world looked like in 2012 or 2014, before the Russians took Crimea and the like. And in the result, what they've been asking for the last year and a half is to fund a stalemate, a protracted stalemate.
That is such an important point. Something that people have been saying, some people have been saying for the last few years since this war started, was that Ukraine never had a chance to win this war and drive Russia out of the Donbass and out of Crimea. That was never possible, despite some of those idiotic generals who go on TV and talk about taking back all this territory. For example, Ben Hodges, he was talking about taking back Crimea. That was a fantasy. Why was he saying it? Who knows? But that could never happen, and all we did was help Ukraine destroy itself. And we have seen the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians for war that Rubio is admitting right now. We knew that they could never win. How sick is that? And what was our true purpose? Well, what did Lloyd Austin say, the former defense secretary? He said we're trying to hurt Russia. The whole thing was about hurting Russia, not about preserving democracy in Ukraine and defending against a madman Putin. We were trying to hurt Russia, and we have hurt Russia. They have been in a war for 3 years now, but we did not achieve our goal of causing the collapse of the Russian government. And all we've done is just get a lot of people killed. So Rubio, as a person, again, who was very neoconish back in 2016, admitting this is a huge step. Although, of course, he does say that Putin's a terrible guy and he invaded all that. So, we have to grade on a curve here.
In which human suffering continues. Meanwhile, Ukraine is being set back 100 years. Their energy grid is being wiped out. I mean, someone's going to have to pay for all this reconstruction after the fact. And how many Ukrainians have left Ukraine living in other countries now? They may never return. I mean, that's their future, and it's endangered in that regard. So the president's point of view is this is a protracted conflict, and it needs to end. Now, it needs to end through a negotiation. In any negotiation, both sides are going to have to give something up. I'm not going to pre-negotiate that. I mean, that's going to be the work of hard diplomacy, which is what we used to do in the world in the past, and we were realistic about it. But both sides in a negotiation have to give something. And that's going to take time. But at least we have a president that recognizes that our objective is this conflict needs to end, and it needs to end in a way that's enduring, because it's an unsustainable. On all sides, it's ultimately unsustainable. For Russia's paying a big price for this in their own economy, their inflation rate and the like. But at the end, that's the president's position. And it's the truth. And I think even a growing number of Democrats would now acknowledge that what we have been funding is a stalemate, a protracted conflict, and maybe even worse than a stalemate, one in which incrementally Ukraine is being destroyed and losing more and more territory. So this conflict needs to end.
Who's the bigger problem in reaching a final negotiated settlement there, right? Is it Putin or is it Zelensky? There's a report out that the Ukrainians are just banking on Putin digging his heels in and becoming annoying to President Trump on this because he won't give an inch, and they're hoping that President Trump will come back over closer to their worldview about Putin, about Russia, about this conflict. So who do you see as the bigger obstacle into getting a negotiated peace there?
Well, I think there's the public and then there's the private, right? So in what you see portrayed publicly in conversations and what leaders say, a lot of it is speaking, they have domestic political considerations. Even Vladimir Putin, who controls media, still has to care about what public opinion is in Russia and his image and what, how his entire personality is built around.
Why do you think he does the shirtless pictures?
He didn't do those anymore. I think it's been a while.
I asked him, why do you do it? When I interviewed him, and he said, I give the people what they want.
Yeah, well, the point is that he has got his own domestic considerations, and so does Zelensky, right? I mean, at the end of the day, he's got, if you imagine if you're a Ukrainian, the Russians have made you suffer so much, and now you're going to let them keep land. I mean, people would be upset about that in Ukraine, and you would understand it. And then there's the mature realities of life on this planet. And that's where this work is going to have to be defined. Both sides are paying a heavy price for this. Both sides have incentive for this conflict to end. Both sides are, it's not going to end with the maximalist goals of either side. And there's going to have to be a lot of hard work done. And I think only the United States, under the leadership of President Trump, can make that possible. But it won't be easy, and it'll take some time. But it's certainly something I know he's strongly committed to seeing happen.
Now, I made a video talking about the possibility or the chances of finding a negotiated settlement in Ukraine. And I said that it's going to be very difficult because the war has gone on so long and so many people have died on both sides, and both leaders don't want to just, throw their hands up and quit because they have to go back to their countrymen and explain why they just stopped the war after sacrificing so much. So my position is that it's going to be very difficult to find a settlement. Now, there are some people who say that Russia is in the catbird seat and that they essentially control everything and have all the leverage, and we essentially have to capitulate to them. I don't feel the same way. Yes, Russia is winning, but they have fought for 3 years. And how many more people does Putin want to lose in order to capture a little more territory? Because like Rubio said, he has to go back to his countrymen and explain his actions. If you are a mother, a sister, a wife in Russia, is it worth fighting for another year and perhaps losing 100,000 more Russian soldiers to get another part of an oblast? Is that worth it? So yes, they could do it, but does Putin want to? And for that reason, I think there's a chance that they can find a settlement and that Putin will agree to make some compromises in a future deal. Although, whatever deal they come to, as Rubio pointed out and as Putin has pointed out, there has to be a lasting peace. This can't be a temporary thing where a few years down the line, this war restarts. So they have to find a permanent solution, and that is going to be very difficult. But if anybody could get it done, it's Donald Trump. certainly not Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. So Rubio is being realistic when it comes to Russia and the Ukraine in this war, and that's where you have to start from. If you're not going to be realistic about what's going on there, there's no chance of finding a deal because you're starting from dog crap. You got to start from a solid base of reality, and Rubio seems to have arrived at that place, which again is a huge departure from years ago, where he just talked about Russia in the absolute worst terms. Again, sounding more like John McCain. So more progress from Rubio, moving in the right direction. And now here is his comments on NATO.
One of those issues that's become dicey within the Republican Party is NATO, which we've talked a lot about these other countries doing their fair share and doing their part. And this is why NATO's become controversial, because there are many people who believe, what are we doing this for? It made sense right after World War II, but does it make sense today? And the United States tends to be the dominant player. The Europeans can support themselves. They don't need the United States to be the big babysitter of the world. And it creates more opportunities for us to get involved in foreign conflicts that we shouldn't be involved in. To that, you say what?
Well, the president's position on NATO is the same every other president has had, and that is that our allies, many of our allies in NATO, do not do enough to provide for their own security. Every other president's made the same complaint. He's just actually been serious about it, and that's what he's pointing to. And look, it's interesting, and in fairness, Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, the closer you are to Russia, the more they're spending as a percentage of their GDP on national defense. But then you have countries like France, okay, or you have countries like Germany. These are big economies, powerful economies, and they don't spend as much on national security. Now, why? Because they rely on NATO. They say, well, we don't need to spend that much on... Yeah, we don't need to spend as much on defense because America has soldiers here, and if they get attacked, they'll be our national defense. So we can instead spend all that money on this enormous social safety net. When you ask those countries, why can't you spend more on national security, their argument is because it would require us to make cuts to welfare programs, to unemployment benefits, to being able to retire at 59 and all these other things. That's a choice they made. But we're subsidizing that. So I think if you were to articulate the president's point on NATO, is number one, they need to do more. And I do think long term, there's a conversation to be had about whether the United States needs to be at the front end of securing the continent or as a backstop to securing the continent. And if you talk to countries on the eastern periphery, the ones closest to Russia, all of them are building the capability to be at the front end. The Poles, the Czechs, all of these different places. And if you move further west to the richest economies, Germany, France, Spain, they don't spend enough on national security. They're relying on us to be the front stop. And that's not an alliance. That's a dependence. And we don't want that. We want NATO. We want a NATO in which we have strong and capable allies. Finland's a very capable ally. They make weapons. They bring something to the table. We need more countries like that to behave in that manner in the alliance. And then it'll be a stronger alliance. And it'll be able to work cooperatively, not just in Europe, but in other challenges we face around the world. Hopefully even the Indo-Pacific, potentially.
I'm not a huge fan of that last part right there, talking about NATO working in the Pacific, because NATO has nothing to do with the Pacific. It was about Europe and confronting the Soviet Union, which no longer exists. So I don't like the idea of this ever-expanding NATO. That's a problem for me. But he does talk about the issue of NATO spending country by country. And yes, Germany, which has a huge economy, only spends 1.5% of their GDP on defense. And that's funny because Germany, a lot of their politicians at least, act like Russia is this grave threat, that Russia is going to go across Ukraine, then invade Poland, and then invade Western Europe. But you judge a country by their actions, not by what they say. And by their actions, it kind of shows that they understand, Germany, that Russia isn't really a threat to them. So does Europe need to do more for itself? Absolutely. But is Russia truly a threat to them? And I think the answer is no. Putin has been very clear on what has gone on in Ukraine and why Russia went into Ukraine. And in 3 years, they haven't even secured the 4 oblasts that they took over. So Russia is not a threat to Poland, not a threat to Romania, and certainly isn't a threat to Germany. Yes, NATO needs to, or NATO countries need to do more, but does the threat really exist? And again, begs the question, do we still need to have NATO? And I think a lot of that will depend on how this war ends, if it ends, and what kind of settlement we get. If it doesn't end, and it's in this, this long stalemate or this long situation where Russia just keeps on chewing away, then yeah, we're going to spend more on NATO. But if we find a deal and work things out, and Russia is reintegrated into Europe, why do we need so much NATO spending, and why do we really need NATO? So for me, NATO is up in the air, and as Rubio talks about, those countries in Europe who say that Russia is a huge threat, they need to do more because that's their backyard, not ours. We are fine. Russia is of no threat to the United States. They are theoretically a threat to Europe, and if they really believe that, they would spend more money. Now, let's get to China. That is really the issue that will consume us going forward in the next several decades, this competition between the United States and China. And on the issue of China, Rubio is a little more hawkish, a little more traditional, Republican, conservative, neocon, whatever you want to call it. Although he is a little more reasonable than some of the real big, China hawks. But again, he is pretty hawkish, and I do have issue with some of the things he has to say. So let's start with him on China.
What about, you mentioned China. Did you recently have a call with the foreign minister? And there was a report that you received a sort of warning that you needed to basically watch.
Yeah, somebody
yourself.
told me that, and that's so two things that the game that they play. Number one is they put out an English translation and they put out a Chinese translation, and they don't always overlap. The call was very straightforward, and I basically said, you're acting in the best interest of China, we're going to act in the best interest of America. We're two great powers, and in areas where we can work together, there's probably no problem in the world we couldn't solve working together. In areas where we have disagreements, we have a responsibility to manage it so it doesn't escalate into something catastrophic, but be clear that we're going to do these things. I did not, at least the translator that was on the call, did not say anything to me that I felt was over the top. But then they put out these games. They like to play these games. Mm-hmm. They put out these translations where it says one thing in English and then it's translated in a different, they use a different term in Mandarin. So he was warned not to overstep himself. They never said that. And if they had, I would have told them, well, I would say the same to you. Don't overstep either. And but that didn't happen, at least not on the call, or at least maybe their interpreter didn't want to interpret it that way. Mm. But that was not the readout we got. But it's silly and and irrelevant. What really matters is the decisions we make moving forward. And China wants to be the most powerful country in the world, and they want to do so at our expense. And that's not in our national interest. And we're going to address it. We don't want a war over it, but we're going to address it.
And that last comment there is what I focus in on. China is trying to overtake us and become the most powerful country on earth at our expense. Is that really the case? And this is something I've talked about in the past, where we view our competition with China as a zero-sum game, where as China, anything that happens that makes China stronger, more powerful, we view it as detracting from the United States. And that is something that I think is dangerous if we view it in those terms. Why can't China just organically, just over time, simply grow their economy to the point where they are the most powerful country in the world? Why are they, why is it necessarily that they're trying to do it by hurting us? And that is, our perception. That's how we perceive it. And that may not actually be the truth. Now, is there some truth to it at some level that they want to hurt us? Well, you can make the argument based on some other activity in the Pacific, but for me, it's hard to say that because I think that China has some right to operate in their sphere in the Pacific. Right now, we are up in arms over China having some access to the Panama Canal in our sphere, and we're saying that should never happen. So we're very protective of the Northern Hemisphere, yet we seem to want to project power into the Pacific And if China pushes back on that, we go, what are you doing? We have freedom of navigation. We can put our ships anywhere we want to. Why are you being so aggressive? So we are a little bit ridiculous as far as how we treat China and their response to our behavior. So China certainly wants to get stronger, and maybe they do want to overtake us and harm us in some way. But our behavior has been equally provocative, if not more so. So I'm not a huge fan of this idea that we have this zero-sum game, and this is essentially what Rubio said. So again, when it comes to China, he's a little more hawkish, a little more neocon than I like. Something to watch. Although again, he's seems to understand that we can't let things get out of hand because it'll be catastrophic for both sides. This next video is about minerals in China. Very interesting. And behind a lot of behavior, it comes down in a lot of cases to economics. Shocker, money. And he talks here about China's pursuit of minerals and the national security issue that brings up for the United States.
And you said something, I think it was at your confirmation hearing, to the effect of, if China gets what it wants in 10 years or so, life could look very different. Like it
maybe
could be
even
dramatic
faster.
for us, for America.
Yeah, so I mean, they can today control. I mean, we love our technology and we need it for all kinds of advances. All of that depends on critical minerals. At the end of the day, ranging aluminum, cobalt, you name it. They have gone around the world buying up mining rights, and they control not just the mining of it, but the refining and the production of it, and the use of it for industrial purposes. So remember during COVID, everybody was freaking out because we couldn't get the masks because they were all made in China. And then we couldn't get this because they were all made in China. We had lost and given away our industrial capacity. This is even graver. This is the rare earth minerals. This is the raw materials necessary for some of the things that go into our most advanced technologies in the defense realm and in medicine. 80-something% of the active ingredients in generic pharmaceuticals in the United States are made in China. We can't make them. So if they decide we're going to cut you off from these things, we'd be in a lot of trouble because we gave away our industrial capacity on those things. That can't continue. That's a vulnerability that we face, and they will use it as leverage. In fact, they are already using it as leverage. For the first time ever, they have actually imposed export controls on critical minerals to damage our national security, but ultimately our technological capacity as well. So it ranges topics, but ultimately, if China controls the means of production for both raw material and industry, then they have total leverage on us economically. And that's the world we're headed to. And I was wrong, maybe not in 10 years, maybe in 5.
And that is true. During COVID, a lot of our the things we needed to respond to that emergency, they were made in China. And I've talked about this in the past. When Trump mentioned that the virus came from Wuhan, it pissed off the Chinese, and they responded by saying, if you keep on talking this way, there's a few supplies you need that we could cut off. So why don't you, calm it down? So Rubio is right. It is a national security concern. And how do you combat that? Well, you have tariffs, import quotas. You take action to build up those industries in your own country and secure those raw materials. So again, when it comes to tariffs, sometimes you need them to protect your country, and it is a national security concern. And on the issue of minerals, it's interesting. Trump recently mentioned that he spoke with Zelensky, and that perhaps we could be paid back by Zelensky by having access to the minerals in Ukraine. And here is a map of the different raw materials in Ukraine, and much of them are in the Donbass, where Russia is right now. So there are a lot of reasons for this war. NATO, having NATO on the Russian border, but economics always plays a key role in wars, and there are a lot of resources that everybody wants in Ukraine, especially in the eastern parts. So another reason why this war started, why the United States wanted more access to Ukraine and those raw materials, and why Russia, didn't want the United States to have access to them. So again, war is always, complicated. There's always more than, several reasons why a war breaks out, but economics is always a reason. And we are competing for those minerals in Ukraine that we could use to bolster our own economy and industries and protect our own national security. So the issue of raw material is very interesting, and that is something that gets overlooked as far as a reason for conflict. And it's interesting that Trump mentioned that, and that here Rubio is talking about it as well, the issue of raw materials and who has access to those raw materials. And the last comment on China by Marco Rubio.
What's been horrifying is that for 25 or 30 years, we've treated China as a developing country, and we allowed them to continue to do things that were unfair. We said, go ahead, let them cheat on trade, let them steal our technology, because when they get rich, they'll become just like us. They became rich, they did not become like us, and now they want to continue to have these unfair benefits. That has to stop.
And they built up their military.
Their military, their industrial capacity, but all over the world, their control of critical minerals. Again, I go back to them because
buying
people
up
don't
land
think
in the
about
United
it.
States.
Buying up farming land in the United States in particular as well, because they need to produce food and they want to be able to control that. They're doing it because it's in their national interest. They are doing, frankly, what I would do, well, maybe not the human rights violations, but they are doing what anyone would do if they were the leader of China. They are acting in China's best interest. What's been missing is American policy that acts in our best interest, and that needs to return.
So he points out that China is doing everything that he would have done if we were China or he was in China, which is take advantage of everything you can to bolster your economy and bolster your military. So he doesn't blame them for stealing our technology if we were going to let them. But one thing he said earlier that is interesting was that we thought as China developed and their economy grew, that China would become more like us and become more liberal. And that did not happen. It's weird. The United States constantly wants to project our values on the entire world, thinking that the rest of the world at some point is going to come along. That hasn't worked in Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria or or Russia. That hasn't worked in China. It hasn't worked at all. So we have to stop thinking that countries are going to be like us. They will not. They are going to continue being whatever it is that they are. But specifically on China, there is an interesting book called The 100-Year Marathon. And one of the things that the U.S. State Department was debating in our think tanks was who is going to eventually hold on to power in China? Will it be the communists, the traditionalist people, or will it be the liberals, the people who want to turn China more into a U.S.-style democracy? And they were having this debate within the United States, again, at the State Department and at the Pentagon, the think tanks. And ultimately, it seems that it was the communists who won out, not the people who wanted to be more pro-U.S. But because of this idea that China would become more liberal, we allowed China to grow unrestrained. We shipped a lot of our industry to China to make a lot of money for our corporations. And now here we are in 2025 going, oh, wow, they've built up their military, they've built up their economy, they built up their manufacturing. And no, they are not America Junior. They are not embracing liberal democracy. And now they're a competitor that we have to worry about. So any idea we had that China was going to transform and ditch all their history and culture and ideas of government and become like us, we're wrong. Didn't happen. And our strategists completely missed the ball on that one. So, man, our foreign policy establishment the last 40 years, nothing but losses. Really, really bad stuff. So anytime I hear these foreign policy experts talk on CNN or MSNBC or CBS about oh my God, Trump is doing this. Well, how dare he? He's going to make everything terrible and worse. I go, what's your record the last 40 years as far as foreign policy? 0 for 100? You've gotten everything wrong. So while we still listen to them, I have no clue. It is incredible that we still do. That people like Bill Kristol can run around talking about foreign policy when he's been wrong about everything. These people have absolutely zero shame. Now the last part, this is on Israel. And yes, Rubio is just like every other Republican neocon on Israel. Pretty much all the same stuff. So this is the one place where if we thought that there was going to be a change in foreign policy from the traditional foreign policy, no. Both sides, Democrat and Republican, when it comes to Israel, all pretty much follow the same line. So nothing new here from Rubio. And in fact, there's a couple things he said that I go, come on, man, you know better than this. So here is Rubio on Israel.
Then there's Israel and the return of the hostages, which still include Americans.
Right.
Supposedly, we're going to get 3 Americans back in the first tranche, the first phase of this hostage deal. Do you believe we will? And what are we going to do if we don't?
Well, I expect we will, because that's the agreement that was made. And but the core problem here remains, and that is ultimately, as long as there is an entity like Hamas, whose express purpose is the destruction of the Jewish state, who is willing to commit horrifying atrocities against civilians, against teenage girls at a concert, and do the things that they've done, and take hostage for 1.5 years babies and elderly, and murder and all the things that they did, that's a threat to Israel's national security. What country in the world can be expected to live alongside an enemy armed, capable, and willing of committing horrifying atrocities? You can't.
It's awful.
So I think that the ceasefire is important because it brought an end to some of the destruction and certainly allowed hostages to be freed at an extraordinary cost. I mean, we're talking about a ratio of 1 to, you get a teenage hostage in exchange for 250 killers, Hamas killers that are released from prison. So just think about how unfair that trade is.
Let me just stop right there. Certainly, there are people in the Israeli prisons who are bad dudes. But there are people in Israeli prisons being held that were never charged or never convicted of any crime. They were rounded up by the IDF. They were sentenced, and they never really had a fair trial. So, yes, there are some bad dudes in those prisons, but not everybody being held by Israel is a terrorist. And that's sort of the narrative we hear, that they're releasing 3,000 terrorists. That's not exactly the case. Yes, there are some guys that were part of Hamas who were engaged in the war. And yes, you can call those guys terrorists, but not everybody. And that's part of the problem and part of the grievance from the Palestinians, that Israel will gather up and detain hundreds of people without trial, put them in jail, and just say that they're terrorists without any actual proof that they are, or any fair court to convict them of actually being terrorists. So it's a really messy situation there, shocker, and trying to unravel what exactly is going on is very challenging, because both sides, the Palestinian side and the Israeli side, put out their propaganda, and we had to sit here in the United States and try to figure out what the heck is going on from thousands of miles away, and it's very, very hard to do.
But it tells you how much, we value life compared to what the other side, the Hamas animals, view this. Now that.
And yeah, issue of valuing life. It's kind of hard to say that it's only we who value life when the IDF has killed probably 40 or 50,000 civilians, and have been very liberal with their use of, large bombs in very, very dense areas. So, yes, the Hamas attack was terrorism, and those people should be eliminated. But the idea that the barbarism is on one side, the IDF, again, has been pretty brutal, not just in this war, but previously against the people in Gaza and people in the West Bank. So it's sad, again, seeing both sides in this long struggle that's been going on for so long. and they both are pretty brutal to one another. And finding a solution for this, I just think it's impossible.
Said, the real challenge here is going to be what happens when the ceasefire period expires. Who's going to govern Gaza? Who's going to rebuild Gaza? Who's going to be in charge of Gaza? Because if the people who are in charge of Gaza are the same guys that created October 7th, then we still have the same problem.
Past is prologue.
It is. And so now the good news in the region is in Lebanon, we have a government that hopefully will become more powerful than Hezbollah in the Lebanese government. And there's a ceasefire that was extended there that ultimately will lead to that. In Syria, a group has taken over. These are not guys that would necessarily pass an FBI background check per se.
No, would not be coming over for Sunday dinner.
But if there's an opportunity in Syria, if there is an opportunity in Syria to create a more stable place than what we've had historically, especially under Assad, where Iran and Russia dominated and where ISIS operated with impunity, we need to pursue that opportunity and see where that leads. And if you...
Now that is a ridiculous statement. He's saying that we have to, or Syria is an opportunity because we can have a more stable Syria than we had under Assad because of the people that took over that we wouldn't invite over for dinner. He's talking about former Al-Qaeda guys, terrorists. Those are the people who took over Syria. So he kind of tries to minimize what they are, and that's ridiculous. They were Al-Qaeda affiliates who took over Syria. And as far as why Syria was unstable, well, Mr. Rubio, you're leaving out the fact that the CIA commenced with Operation Timber Sycamore, where we funneled weapons to terrorists to fight the Assad regime. So we were directly participating in an effort to destabilize Syria and to bring down Assad. So when you say that it was unstable under Assad, but leave out our direct involvement in causing that, that is absolutely ridiculous. So come on, Marco, you know better than that.
You have a region in which you have a more stable Syria, a more stable Lebanon where Hezbollah is not able to do the things it does on behalf of Iran, a weakened Iran, who's now lost all of these proxies. It now opens the door to things like a deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel, which would change the dynamic of the region. And then ultimately, not make easy, but make easier resolving some of these challenges that we face with the Palestinian question, and in particular with the Gaza question. So there's a lot of work to be done there. None of it is certain. All of it is hard, but real opportunities that we couldn't have even imagined 90 days ago.
Well, he is right about one thing. So much has changed over the last 90 days that there is an opportunity perhaps to bring some element of peace to the region. But as he points out, it's going to be very difficult. And everything around Israel as far as trying to bring peace to the region is almost an impossible task. And if history is a lesson for us, it's probably not going to happen. It might be just one of those things that you can't fix, and it's unfortunate because Israel is it's a beautiful region, and it would be nice to finally end this conflict there, but I just don't see any realistic way it ends. There's too much bad blood on both sides, and they're too ideologically driven. So he's being more optimistic than I would be, but he's right. A lot has happened the last 90 days, and with a new landscape, perhaps there is a slightly better chance for some deals that could bring some peace to the region. So that is Marco Rubio's interview with Megyn Kelly. Again, he is good in some areas. He does seem, and this is important, he mentioned several times the president's view, the president's ideas, and that signals to me that he is working hard to do what Trump wants, not what he wants or what the deep state wants. And that is a very important thing. Whose foreign policy is he going to execute? Donald Trump's foreign policy or the deep state's foreign policy? And he's signaling so far by what he's saying that he's trying to execute Trump's foreign policy. And that is a good thing. And that is a departure from Trump 1.0, where his secretaries of state were sort of doing their own thing. Rex Tillerson and later Mike Pompeo. Now, people think Pompeo was a Trump ally. there is a reason why Pompeo is not part of the Trump administration and why Trump publicly stated that he would not be part of his administration. And that's because Pompeo is a very smart but very cunning guy. And behind the scenes, he was working against Trump, although to his face and in front of cameras, he was always very complimentary, smiling, and coming off like a loyal soldier. And he was not. So Pompeo was a snake, and that's why he is not part of the Trump administration. But Rubio seems to be making a real effort to be part of the America First movement and fulfill the foreign policy objectives of Donald Trump. And hopefully that is what he does. That would be great. But again, we'll keep an eye on him because, make sure he doesn't backslide to some of his older positions. But I am encouraged. He's not perfect. That's important to say. He's not perfect. If you're looking for a perfect person, you're not being realistic. And there are some people, libertarians, who are often so consumed by their idealism that they overlook progress and just go, oh, this guy has his flaws, so I'm going to be angry and stomp my feet. Sometimes you have to compromise. Sometimes you have to accept that you're going to have very flawed people, but people who will move things in the right direction. And I'm hopeful that Marco Rubio is that person and moves things in the right direction and moves us to a more peaceful world. But we will just have to wait and see. We got 4 years left to watch and see what he does. Well, that is it for now. Thank you for joining me. And if you're new to my channel, please like and subscribe. See you next time.